The wind in Evermeadow had teeth, and it bit clean through the wool of Grace Walker's coat. It was a high country wind, born on saw-toothed peaks and carrying the scent of pine and an ice that never fully melted. When the stagecoach shuddered to a stop, its leather suspension groaning in protest, the silence that followed was just as sharp as the wind. The town, if one could call it that, was a handful of sturdy buildings huddled together against the vast, unforgiving landscape, their planked faces weathered to the color of old bone. A general store, a saloon whose bat-wing doors seemed to be chattering in the cold, a smithy, and a small post office made up the main street. There was no welcome here, only the stoic reality of survival. Grace paid the driver, her gloved hands stiff as she counted the coins. Her trunk was lowered into the muddy street with a heavy thud. It contained everything she had allowed herself from her old life, a curated collection of a person she no longer was, or perhaps never had been. She did not ask for directions. The letters from Arthur had been precise, filled with a man's pride in his claim. A quarter-mile past the last building, where the valley opened up and the creek made a gentle curve. He had described the cabin he was building, the way the morning sun would hit the porch, the stand of cottonwoods that would offer shade in the summer. He had painted a picture with his words, a life of simple, honest toil, a life she desperately needed. She left the trunk with the station master, promising to return, and began the walk. The mud tried to claim her boots with every step, a thick, greedy suction that spoke of a late, unseasonable thaw followed by a hard freeze. The sky was a vast, bruised sheet of gray, promising more snow. As she cleared the town, the valley did open up, just as he had said. The creek was a ribbon of dark, rushing water, but where the cabin should have been, where the morning sun was meant to bless a new porch, there was only a black scar on the land. The smell hit her first, the acrid bite of charred pine and wet ash. A few stone pillars of a foundation stood like broken teeth. Blackened timbers lay in a chaotic jumble. A skeleton picked clean by fire. A single chimney stack rose defiantly into the gray sky. A tombstone for a dream she had traveled 2,000 miles to find. Grace walked the perimeter of the ruin, her footsteps soundless on the sodden, ashen earth. There was nothing to salvage. A twisted piece of metal that might have been a cook stove. Shards of a porcelain plate, its delicate blue flower pattern stained with soot. She knelt and picked up a piece, the sharp edge cold against her palm. This was to have been her home, this pile of ash and sorrow. She felt a hollowness spread through her chest, a cold far deeper than the wind could inflict. It was not grief for Arthur, not yet. He was a man she knew only through carefully worded letters. A respectable arrangement made through her family's distant connections to escape a future she could not bear. The hollowness was for the idea of this place, for the quiet, deliberate life she had imagined building here, board by board. That life had burned down before she even arrived. Turning her back on the ruin, she walked back to the town, her spine straight, her jaw set. The post office was small and smelled of canvas mailbags and drying ink. The postmaster, a man with a beard more gray than brown, looked up over his spectacles. "Help you, ma'am?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "I am looking for information on Arthur Gable. His claim is just east of here." The man's eyes softened with a practiced pity she recognized from 100 other faces in 100 other situations. Gable? Yes, the fire was about a month back. Terrible thing. Volunteer crew went out, but the wind was fierce that night. Nothing they could do. Grace kept her voice steady. "And Mr. Gable?" He reached under the counter and pulled out a letter, its edges slightly curled. The handwriting on the front was not Arthur's. It was a formal, official script. This came for him, or for his next of kin. "Figured it might be you, if you were the one he was writing to." He pushed it across the counter. "The letter inside explains it better than I can. He joined a survey party heading into the mountains. A rock slide. No survivors found. I am truly sorry. Ma'am." She took the letter, her fingers not trembling. She would not allow them to. She did not open it. She did not need to. The finality was in the postmaster's tone, in the sealed envelope that felt as heavy as a stone. Dead or missing. In this country, they were often the same thing. She had come all this way for a ghost, to build a life on a foundation of ash. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling foreign in her own mouth. She tucked the letter into her reticule. The man watched her, his expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. A lone woman, a burned claim, a dead fiancé. It was the stuff of town gossip for a month. Grace stepped back out into the wind. The options laid themselves out before her with brutal clarity. Take the next stagecoach back east, back to the gilded cage she had fled, or stay. But stay where stay for what? The idea of returning was a physical nausea. She would rather freeze to death on this unforgiving patch of earth than return to the suffocating silence of her father's house. To the whispers and the expectations, and the man they had chosen for her after this arrangement had failed. Her eyes scanned the landscape, the town huddled in the valley floor. But higher up, on the slope of the hill that overlooked Ever Meadow, a thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney. A lantern cast a steady, golden light from a window, a single point of warmth in the encroaching twilight. It was a workshop of some kind. She could just make out the shape of it. It looked solid, grounded. Without allowing herself a moment to reconsider, she started the climb. The path was steep and slick with patches of ice hidden beneath a thin layer of snow. Her lungs burned with the effort and the thin air. By the time she reached the broad, heavy door, her breath was coming in ragged clouds. The scent of fresh-cut pine was strong here, clean and sharp. She could hear the rhythmic, whispery scrape of a hand plane against wood. It was a sound of purpose, of creation. She knocked, her knuckles rapping hard against the solid oak. The sound inside stopped. A moment later, the door opened. The man who stood there was tall, broad-shouldered, and filled the frame. He wore a heavy leather apron over a flannel shirt, and sawdust clung to his dark hair and beard. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were wary. And then she saw it. His left sleeve was pinned neatly at the elbow. He had only one arm. He did not speak, simply looked at her, waiting. "Forgive the intrusion," Grace began, her voice clear despite the cold. "My name is Grace Walker. I have just arrived in Ever Meadow." His gaze was steady, unreadable. "This is not the boarding house." "I am aware. I saw your light. I need a place to stay for the night, just until I can make other arrangements. I am willing to pay, or to work." He looked past her, down toward the valley, then back at her face, studying it in the fading light. He seemed to be weighing not just her words, but the very fiber of her being. She met his gaze without flinching. A lifetime of holding her own against powerful men having taught her the art of stillness. "The loft is dry," he said at last, his voice a low baritone. "Rough like unfinished wood. Hay bales are clean. There is a spare blanket." He stepped back, holding the door open just enough for her to enter. The workshop was cavernous and warmer than she could have imagined. A large wood stove in the corner radiated a powerful heat. The entire space was filled with the clean, almost sacred scent of lumber. Stacks of wood were neatly organized against one wall. Tools hung in precise order from another. In the center of the room, a massive table was being built, its legs thick and sturdy, its surface smooth as water. It was a place of order, of craft, of quiet dedication. "I am Samuel Reed," he said, closing the door and shutting out the wind. The silence in the workshop was now filled with the crackle of the fire. "I am grateful, Mr. Reed." He nodded toward the corner. "There is water in the basin, and coffee in the pot on the stove, if you want it." He then turned back to his workbench, picking up the plane as if she were no longer there. But before he resumed his work, he paused. "I have 2 rules in my house. Miss Walker. She waited. No liquor and no lies. He said it without looking at her, his attention on the grain of the wood before him. The words were not a suggestion. They were the foundation stones of his home, as solid as the rock chimney.
I can abide by those rules, Mr. Reed.
Good. He drew the plane across the wood, and the whispering scrape began again. Grace moved to the stove, her frozen fingers aching as she wrapped them around a warm mug of coffee. It was black and strong, and it burned a trail of life down into her core. She looked at this man, Samuel Reed. He worked with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing. A system of levers and clamps, operated by his foot, held the wood steady, allowing his single, powerful arm to guide the tool with an artist's precision. He was a man who had adapted to loss, who had reshaped his world to fit what remained of him, and had made it work. There was no self-pity in his movements, only focus. Later, he gestured with his head toward a sturdy ladder leading up to the loft. The blanket is at the top. She climbed, her body weary from the journey and the day's shocks. The loft was just as he had described. It was clean, smelled of dry hay and pine, and a thick wool blanket was folded neatly on a pile of bales. A small, high window looked out over the valley. The lights of Evermeadow were few and scattered, lonely specks in an ocean of darkness. She could see the black patch of earth where her claim was, a void in the landscape. Lying in the relative warmth, wrapped in the blanket, Grace did not cry. The tears were a luxury she could not afford. The carefully constructed plan for her life lay in ashes, both figuratively and literally. Arthur Gable, the respectable man who was to be her husband and partner, was gone. She was alone, with a small trunk of possessions and a dwindling supply of money. The letter in her reticule, the one from the postmaster, felt like a chain pulling her down. But there was another letter in there as well, one tucked into a secret pocket, sealed with the crest of a family she had renounced, a name she had buried. Whitmore. Samuel Reed's rule echoed in the quiet of the loft. No lies. She had already broken it by giving him the name Walker. A small lie, a necessary one for protection. Her true name carried weight, the kind of weight that attracted attention, the kind of men she had traveled 2,000 miles to escape. The irony was bitter. She had fled a dishonest world, only to begin her new, honest life with a lie. But another thought, hard and clear as quartz, began to form in her mind. The land was still there. The soil beneath the ash was still good. A burned claim. A dead owner. The land would go up for auction, for taxes. She had enough money for that, if she was careful. She did not need a husband to sign a deed. She did not need permission. She had come here not simply to marry, but to build something of her own. The fire and the rock slide had not destroyed the land itself. Only one path to it. A new resolve settled over her, quiet and fierce. She would not be a victim. She would not be a pitiful curiosity for the town of Evermeadow. She would stay. She would work, and she would buy that land. She would build her own house, with her own hands if she had to, on that very spot. Let them whisper. Let them wonder where a lone woman got her money. Her past was a ghost, but it had given her one thing, the means to forge a future. Down below, the sound of the plane finally stopped. She heard the scrape of a bench being moved, the clink of a tool being put away. The fire in the stove was damped for the night. The workshop fell silent, in the profound quiet of the mountain night, sheltered by the craft of a stranger. Grace Walker, born Grace Whitmore, closed her eyes. The ground could burn, she thought. The wind could howl. But in the heart, if one was stubborn enough, there was always a place left to sow. Morning came not with a gentle dawn, but with a sharpening of the cold and a gray light that filtered through the loft's high window. Grace was already awake, her body stiff from the unaccustomed bed of hay bales. Below, The sounds of a new day had begun, the metallic scrape of the stove being cleared, the splash of water, the solid thud of a log being set on the fire. She descended the ladder to find Samuel Reed by the stove, a pot of coffee already brewing. He acknowledged her with a slight nod, his focus on slicing a thick piece of bacon with a long, sharp knife. The silence between them was not awkward. It was functional, like the well-oiled tools hanging on the wall. "There is porridge," he said, gesturing with the knife toward a sack of oats. "And there is work, if you mean to earn your keep."
I do,
Grace said, her voice firm.
She would not be a charity case.
"What needs doing?" His gaze swept over her, taking in the fine wool of her traveling dress, the soft leather of her city boots. It was not a judgmental look, merely an assessing one. "There is a cord of pine that needs to be sorted and stacked, clear grain from knotted. The work is hard on the hands."
"My hands are capable,"
she replied, leaving no room for argument. After a breakfast of porridge and strong coffee, he led her to a massive pile of rough sawn lumber outside the workshop. The wind was relentless, whipping at her skirts and chilling her to the bone. He showed her what to look for: the straight, uninterrupted lines of clear wood, perfect for flooring or tabletops, and the swirling, dark-eyed patterns of knotted wood, useful for rough framing or firewood. He taught her how to stack it so the air could circulate, preventing rot. Then he left her to it. The planks were heavy, and the rough surfaces snagged at the fabric of her dress and scraped her unprotected hands. At first, her movements were clumsy, inefficient. She struggled with the weight and the awkward lengths, but she did not stop. She methodically lifted each piece, examined it in the cold light, and carried it to the correct stack. Her back began to ache, a low, persistent fire, and her arms felt heavy as lead. She was driven by a cold, stubborn pride. This was the first plank of her new life. It was heavy and rough, but she could lift it. From inside the workshop, Samuel watched her through the window for a time. He saw the initial struggle, the grim set of her jaw. He saw her drop a heavy plank and stand for a moment, breathing hard, before bending to pick it up again. He saw her determination, a quality as straight and unbending as the clearest grain of cedar. Then he turned back to his own work. The days fell into a rhythm. In the morning, Grace would sort and stack lumber, clean the workshop, or sharpen tools under Samuel's terse instruction. In the afternoon, he began to teach her the rudiments of his craft. He never mentioned her past or asked why she was here. His questions were always practical. "Can you hold this steady? Did you measure twice? Do you see the way this grain will want to split?" He showed her his unique way of working, a marvel of ingenuity. A complex system of foot pedals controlled vices and clamps on his workbench, holding pieces of wood more securely than a second hand ever could. He had fashioned a harness of leather straps that allowed him to use his body weight to guide a two-person saw. He was not a disabled man. He was a master craftsman who had simply re-engineered his world to his own specifications. One afternoon, he was planning a long piece of oak. "You read the wood before you cut it," he said, his voice low over the whisper of the blade. He ran his hand over the surface. "Same as you read a person. See this knot here? It is a weakness, a place of old injury. You have to work around it, or it will ruin the whole board. And this grain, how it twists away, that is a stubborn streak. It will fight you. You have to approach it with respect, from the right angle, or it will splinter." He looked at her, his stormy eyes direct. "Wood does not lie. Miss Walker, it tells you its whole story, if you are patient enough to listen." Grace thought of the lies she was holding, the story she was hiding. She nodded, understanding more than he knew. And the clear grain. "That is what you build with," he said, a hint of something like warmth in his tone. "That is the strength, the honesty. You find that, and you can build something that will last 100 years. After a week of labor, her meager supplies were running low. She needed flour, salt, and soap. It was time to face the town. Samuel offered to get the things for her, but she refused. She could not hide on his hill forever. She walked into Ever Meadow with her back straight, a small list clutched in her hand. The general store was the town's hub, a warm, cluttered space that smelled of coffee beans, cured meats, and kerosene. A few women were gathered near the fabric bolts, their conversation dropping to a murmur as Grace entered. The storekeeper, a balding man named Henderson, gave her a polite but curious nod. As she gathered her items, a woman detached herself from the group and approached. She was impeccably dressed for a town like Ever Meadow, her dress of dark, rich silk, a cameo brooch at her throat. Her hair was perfectly coiled, and her smile was sharp and bright. This had to be Miranda Caldwell, the woman the postmaster had mentioned, the wife of the town's most prominent rancher and its self-appointed social arbiter.
"Good morning, Mrs." Caldwell said, her voice smooth as polished stone. "You must be the newcomer, Miss Walker, is it not?"
"It is," Grace replied, her tone even.
"A terrible tragedy about your fiancé. The whole town is just heartbroken for you." The words were sympathetic, but the eyes were not. They were probing, calculating. It is a difficult thing for a woman to be alone in a place like this.
"Are you planning on returning east soon?" "My plans are not yet settled," Grace said calmly, placing a sack of flour on the counter. Miranda Caldwell's smile tightened.
"I see, and you are staying up at the carpenter's place.
An unconventional arrangement.
To be sure, Samuel Reed keeps to himself, a man with his history. It is probably for the best."
The insinuation was clear. A delicate poison dripped into the air. Grace turned to face her fully. She did not raise her voice. She did not show a flicker of anger. "Mr. Reed has been a gentleman. He offered me shelter when I had none, and work to pay for it. I have found his character to be as solid and true as the houses he builds." A flush crept up Miranda's neck. She had expected a flustered, perhaps tearful, young woman. She had not expected this quiet, unshakable composure. The other women were watching, listening intently. "Well," Miranda said, recovering quickly, "I am sure your Eastern sensibilities will find our little town rustic. We are a simple community here. We value propriety." "I value hard work and honest dealings," Grace countered gently. "I am sure we will find common ground there. Mrs. Caldwell," she paid Mr. Henderson for her goods, nodded politely to the silent group of women, and walked out of the store, leaving a ripple of stunned silence in her wake. When she returned to the workshop, her hands were trembling slightly from the encounter. She set the provisions down and went straight to the woodpile, needing the solid, uncomplicated reality of the labor. She worked for an hour, her movements fierce and rhythmic, until the tremor subsided. Samuel came out, carrying something in his hand. He had watched her return, had seen the rigid set of her shoulders. He did not ask what had happened. He simply stood before her as she paused to wipe a stray strand of hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist. He saw her hands, red and raw, with the beginnings of blisters forming on her palms. Wordlessly, he held out a pair of thick leather work gloves. They were well made, stitched with strong thread, and softened with use, but still sturdy. Grace looked from the gloves to his face. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held a flicker of something. Understanding, perhaps. It was not pity. It was respect. He was not giving her a gift. He was giving her a tool. He was acknowledging her as a worker, a partner in the toil. It was a gesture of trust more profound than any words of comfort could ever be. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick. She took the gloves and pulled them on. They were large, but they were a shield. They were an acceptance. She worked until dusk, and the next day, and the day after that. The gloves became a second skin. Her muscles hardened, and her movements became sure and efficient. A quiet partnership formed between her and Samuel, built in the shared space of sawdust and silence. They spoke little, but they worked together. A team. 2 weeks after her arrival, Grace walked into town again. She bypassed the general store and went straight to the small building that served as the county clerk's office. The man at the desk was the same postmaster who had given her the letter about Arthur. He looked up, surprised to see her. "Miss Walker." "Good day, Mr. Harris," she said. "I am here about the Gable claim, the one that burned." "Yes. I understand the property taxes are delinquent. I would like to pay the first installment." "Mr. Harris blinked, his pen hovering over a ledger. "Ma'am, that is unusual." "I have the money," she said, and she laid the coins on the counter. They made a crisp, clear sound in the quiet room. It was not a fortune, but it was enough. It was a stake, a claim of her own. He stared at the money, then at her determined face. He was a man who knew the town's every secret, every whisper. He knew this act would ignite a firestorm of speculation. With a sigh, he slowly reached for his receipt book and began to write. Grace took the receipt and walked out into the cold afternoon air. She knew what she had done. The questions would start now, spreading from the clerk's office to the general store, from the saloon to the ranches in the valley. A lone woman, a dead man's land, and money from a source no one could name. The wind felt different now. It was no longer just the impersonal cold of the mountains. It was carrying whispers, and they were all about her. The distant, mournful cry of a train whistle was a sound that did not belong in the valley. It was a serpent of steam and iron, a voice from another world that slithered through the mountain passes and momentarily silenced the wind. Inside the workshop, the rhythmic rasp of Grace's sanding block faltered. She looked up at Samuel, who had also paused, his hand resting on the frame of a window he was joining. His expression was unreadable, but his stillness was absolute. The sound was a herald, an omen, and they both seemed to feel it in the quiet air of the workshop. An hour later, as Grace was sweeping the fine layer of sawdust from the floor, a shadow fell across the open doorway. It was not the familiar shape of a townsperson. This shadow was sharp, clean-edged, and belonged to a man who wore a finely tailored city suit and polished leather shoes that were entirely unsuited for the muddy path leading up the hill. He stepped inside, bringing with him the scent of coal smoke and expensive cologne. He was handsome in a severe, clean-shaven way, with pale eyes that took in the rustic workshop with a flicker of condescending amusement. He removed his hat, revealing perfectly parted dark hair. His smile did not reach his eyes. "Grace, my dear," he said, his voice smooth and cultured, a stark contrast to the gruff tones of Evermeadow. "You have led us on quite a chase." Grace's blood ran cold. She recognized him instantly. Charles Barrington. His family were partners in the Whitmore textile mills, and he was the company's chief legal counsel, a man whose civility was the velvet glove over an iron fist. He was the embodiment of the world she had fled. "Charles," she said, her voice betraying none of the shock she felt. Her hand tightened on the broom handle. "You are a long way from home." "As are you," he countered, his smile unwavering. "Your father has been beside himself with worry. The entire family has. We presumed the worst, until my inquiries led me to a stagecoach ticket purchased under the name Walker." His eyes swept past her to Samuel, who had not moved from his workbench but now stood like a mountain, his one powerful arm resting near a heavy mallet. Charles dismissed him with a glance. "We need you to come home. Grace, matters at the company are complicated. Your signature is required on several documents." "I have no signature to give," she said, her voice low and steady. "My business with the Whitmore Barrington Corporation is finished. I sent a letter to that effect months ago." "A letter from a distraught young woman is hardly a legal instrument," Charles said dismissively. "You are still a significant shareholder. a fact your father has managed to keep quiet. Your disappearance has caused a great deal of instability. You have responsibilities. My only responsibility is to the life I am building here." Charles took a step closer, his voice dropping to a confidential, menacing purr. "This life." He gestured vaguely at the sawdust and the raw wood. "This is a temporary folly. Grace, a game of rustic living. It is time to put it aside and return to your duties. Your family requires it. The company requires it." He looked directly at her. "I require it." The threat was unspoken, but clear. He would not leave without her. He would use the full power of the Whitmore name and fortune to drag her back. "This is my home now," she stated, each word a stone laid in a foundation. "You are trespassing." "Charles," for the first time. His smile faltered. He glanced again at Samuel, who met his gaze with an unnerving, silent intensity. Charles seemed to decide that this was not the time or place for a prolonged battle. He placed his hat back on his head with a deliberate, almost theatrical gesture. "I am staying at the hotel in town," he said. "We will speak again when you have had time to reconsider your position. Do not make this more difficult than it needs to be." He turned and walked out, his polished shoes leaving precise, out-of-place prints in the dirt. The silence he left behind was heavier than before. Grace stood frozen, the broom still in her hand, her knuckles white. The past she had run from had not only found her, it had walked into her sanctuary and threatened to tear it down. Samuel finally moved. He walked to the doorway and stared down the path where Charles had disappeared. After a long moment, he closed the heavy door, shutting out the world. He turned to her, his face grim. "No lies, Miss Walker," he said, his voice quiet but resonant. That was the rule. Grace felt a wave of shame, followed by a surge of defiance. She could not bear for this man, of all people, to think her a common deceiver. She owed him the truth, all of it. She put down the broom. "My name is not Walker," she said, her voice shaking slightly but gaining strength with each word. "It is Whitmore, Grace Whitmore. My father is Daniel Whitmore, of the Whitmore Barrington Mills in Boston." Samuel's face did not change, but his eyes, those stormy gray eyes, watched her with an intense focus, as if he were examining the grain of a difficult piece of wood. "Charles Barrington is the company lawyer. My family practically owns him. They sent him to bring me back." She took a breath, the confession spilling out of her now. "I left because I could no longer be a part of what they do. They call it industry, but it is a kind of slow theft. They buy up farms for the water rights, leaving the land to wither. They pay the mill workers just enough to survive, but never enough to leave, trapping them in company housing, in company debt. I saw families broken by it, children sent to work in the factories because their parents could not earn a living wage. I saw the river behind our main factory run black with dye. They are building an empire on the backs of people who have no power to fight back." Her voice was raw with a passion he had never heard from her before. "I tried to change things from within. I spoke to my father. He called me naive. I spoke to the board. They called me a sentimentalist. They told me it was the cost of progress. I could not put my name to that kind of progress. So I decided my name would no longer exist. I took what little money I had from my mother's inheritance, a sum I could claim without my father's approval, and I disappeared. I invented Grace Walker. I came here to build a life where the work of my hands would be honest, where what I built would stand for something good." She finally fell silent, her story hanging in the sawdust-scented air. She had broken his rule. She had lived a lie under his roof. She waited for his judgment, for the anger, for the order to leave. Samuel was quiet for a long time. He walked over to his workbench and picked up a piece of smooth, clear pine. He ran his thumb along the grain. "Whitmore," he said, testing the name. He looked up at her, and his gaze was not angry. It was something deeper, something knowing. The name is not the person, any more than the label on a crate tells you the quality of the wood inside. He set the piece of pine down. "You did not lie about the work. Your hands have been honest here." Relief washed over Grace so intensely her knees felt weak. He understood. He did not condone the lie, but he understood the truth behind it, in his simple, profound way. He had separated the person from the name, the intent from the act. The next day, a grim purpose settled over her. Charles Barrington would not be so easily deterred. He would use law and money, his two great weapons, to force her compliance. She had to fight back with the same tools. After their morning work, she put on her coat and walked to town. The air seemed charged, and she felt the curious stares of the townspeople like a physical touch. News of the fancy stranger from the east had surely spread like wildfire. She went directly to the telegraph office. "Mr." Harris looked up, his expression a mixture of apprehension and insatiable curiosity. Another telegram. "Ma'am." "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. She took the pencil and the flimsy paper and wrote, her hand steady. The message was to Elias Blackstone, her late mother's lawyer, an old, honorable man, who had always shown her kindness and who distrusted her father's unbridled ambition. "Elias Blackstone, Esquire, Boston. Stop. Barrington is in Evermeadow. Stop. He demands my return and signature. Stop. I require immediate dispatch of all legal documents pertaining to the full and irrevocable severance of my inheritance and all ties to Whitmore Barrington Corporation. Stop. I will not return. Stop. Act with all possible haste. Grace Whitmore." She pushed the paper across the counter. "Mr.?" Harris's eyes widened as he read the name at the end. The whispered rumors now had a name, and it was a name that sounded of power and money far beyond anything Evermeadow had ever known. He tapped out the message, the clicking of the machine sounding like a declaration of war. Grace walked out of the office, feeling as though she had crossed a line from which there was no return. The fight was now in the open. As she passed the general store, she saw Miranda Caldwell speaking with two other women on the porch. Miranda's eyes locked onto Grace, and her polite smile was gone, replaced by a look of open hostility and suspicion. The arrival of Charles Barrington had confirmed all her worst assumptions. Grace was not just a grieving fiancée. She was something other, something complicated and, in Miranda's eyes, dangerous to the town's simple social order. Grace met her glare without wavering and continued up the hill. She had made her move. Now she and Samuel could only wait and work, finding a strange comfort in the shared, honest labor that defined their days. 3 days later, the tension broke. Grace had gone to town for a sack of nails. As she approached Henderson's store, she noticed a small cluster of people gathered by the community notice board on the outside wall. They were murmuring, pointing at a piece of paper that had been tacked there. As she drew closer, the small crowd fell silent and parted. Turning to stare at her, her heart hammered against her ribs. Nailed to the rough wood of the notice board was a sheet of thick, cream-colored stationery, the kind Charles Barrington would use. Written on it in a flawless, elegant script were words meant for the entire town to see. It was not a formal notice. It was a simple, public message. For the attention of Miss Grace Whitmore, regarding a matter of urgent family duty, your immediate compliance is expected. The name, her name, Whitmore, pinned up like a wanted poster, stripping away her anonymity, exposing her secret to the wind and the whispers and the judging eyes of every person in Evermeadow. The shadow that had followed her from Boston had finally, irrevocably, fallen across her new life. Charles Barrington's public notice was a declaration of war, and the town of Evermeadow was the battlefield. Whispers followed Grace like her own shadow, turning heads in the general store, silencing conversations in the saloon. The name Whitmore, now stripped bare for all to see, was a foreign object, a piece of city finery dropped in the mud, and the town did not know what to make of it. Some saw wealth and opportunity, others saw trouble and deceit. Miranda Caldwell saw her chance. She called for a town meeting. It was an unofficial gathering, held in the cavernous main room of the general store, a space that smelled of burlap, coffee, and damp wool. Nearly everyone came, drawn by the promise of drama. They stood between barrels of flour and stacks of canned goods, their faces lit by the yellow glow of kerosene lanterns, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Miranda stood near the counter, a self-appointed queen holding court. Charles Barrington was beside her, looking calm and proprietary, as if the entire proceeding were a foregone conclusion. Samuel Reed stood in the back, near the door, his presence a silent, solid anchor in the shifting sea of public opinion. He did not look at Grace, but she could feel his stillness across the room. Miranda began, her voice ringing with false concern. "Friends, neighbors, we are a community built on trust and hard work. We welcome honest folk, but questions have been raised that touch the very heart of our town. A claim, left by a good man who met a tragic end, is now being pursued by an outsider, a woman who came to us under a false name." She paused, letting the words sink in. A woman of considerable and unknown financial means. We have a right to know who we are living amongst. We have a right to question a land transaction that began with a deception. A murmur went through the crowd. Charles Barrington allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. "I move," Miranda declared, "that the town council petition the district judge to review, and perhaps nullify, the tax auction proceedings regarding the old Gable claim, pending a full investigation into the background of Miss Whitmore." All eyes turned to Grace. This was her trial by rumor, her judgment by the court of public opinion. She felt a tremor in her hands, but willed it to stop. She stepped forward from the shadows, her worn work glove still tucked into her belt, a smudge of pine sap on her cheek. She looked not at Miranda, but at the faces in the crowd, the blacksmith, the ranchers, the Wilkins family huddled in the corner. "My name is Grace Whitmore," she said, her voice quiet but carrying in the packed room. "That is true. I came here as Grace Walker because I sought a new life, separate from a family and a name I could no longer claim in good conscience. That was a private matter, between myself and my past. It was not a deception aimed at this town." She held up the receipt from Mr. Harris's office. "My business with the Gable claim, however, has been public and legal. I paid the delinquent taxes, as is the right of any citizen. Here is the county receipt. My funds are my own, from an inheritance left by my mother, entirely separate from the business master. Barrington represents," she looked directly at Charles, "a business whose practices I find morally unacceptable, which is why I left." She turned back to the crowd. "I did not come here to take anything. I plan to build a home on that land. I plan to be a good neighbor. I have asked for nothing from this town but the chance to prove myself through my own labor. Judge me by the work of my hands, not by the name I was born with or the rumors spread by those who wish to see me gone." Her simple, direct words hung in the air. She had not been emotional. She had not pleaded. She had stated facts. An old rancher near the front spoke up, his voice a gravelly rumble. "The boy's dead. The land was fallow. She paid the tax. Seems legal enough to me." "It is the principle of the thing," Miranda snapped, her composure cracking. "We cannot have wealthy Easterners using legal loopholes to snatch up land." "Better her than some railroad syndicate," another voice called from the back. The room erupted into a dozen different arguments. Mr. Henderson, the store owner, banged a wooden mallet on the counter for order. "This is not a court of law," he said, his face flushed. "But it is a town. We have to live with each other. A vote is called for. Do we petition the judge to halt the proceedings? As Mrs. Caldwell suggests." The show of hands was messy, uncertain. About a third of the room sided with Miranda. Another third seemed to side with Grace. The rest abstained, their faces troubled. Finally, Mr. Hargrove, The old schoolteacher, who was now mostly blind but whose mind was sharp as a tack, spoke from his chair near the stove.
"It seems to me," he said, his reedy voice cutting through the noise, "that we have two separate issues. One is a legal matter for a judge to decide. The other is a community matter. The law will run its course. The question for us, tonight, is are we a town that shuns a person based on suspicion, or one that waits to judge them on their character?"
His words settled the matter. The final, informal vote was a compromise born of frontier pragmatism. They would not officially petition the judge, but they would await his ruling on any challenges filed. And in the meantime, they would not shun Grace Whitmore. They would watch, and they would wait. It was not a victory, but it was not a defeat. It was a chance. In the weeks that followed, Grace knew she was being tested. She set about earning the town's trust, not with words, but with actions. One afternoon, she saw Mr. Wilkins on the roof of his small, dilapidated cabin, struggling to patch a leak before a coming rain. The next morning, Grace was there, a bundle of fresh shingles under her arm, which she had purchased with her own money. She climbed the ladder and spent the day working alongside him, her hands showing him the proper way to lay and nail the shingles, a skill Samuel had patiently taught her. Mrs. Wilkins brought them water, her eyes wide with a gratitude that was worth more than all the votes in the general store. She learned that the Wilkinses' eldest boy, a quiet child of 10, could not read his own name. She began spending an hour every evening at their small cabin, using a charred stick and a piece of smooth planking to teach him his letters. Soon, 2 other children from a neighboring homestead joined them. Mr. Hargrove heard of it and sent over a tattered but beloved copy of a McGuffey reader, his silent endorsement. When a lung fever swept through the valley, laying low 6 families, Grace worked with Mrs. Langston, the town widow, brewing willow bark tea to bring down fevers and mixing honey and mullein for the relentless coughs. She sat up through the night with a sick child, her calm presence a comfort to his terrified parents. The town watched. They saw the woman with the fancy name and the secret past hauling water, teaching children, and nursing the sick. The whispers began to change. Suspicion, slowly, cautiously, began to turn into a grudging respect. Then the storm came. It was not a normal mountain squall. It was a fury, a living thing made of wind and ice that screamed down from the peaks. It hit just after dusk, shaking the workshop to its foundations. The wind howled like a predator, and sleet hammered against the windows like thrown gravel. Grace and Samuel worked together in the lantern light, checking the braces on the heavy doors, securing a loose shutter that was banging violently against the wall. They did not speak, moving with the practiced rhythm of 2 people who understood their work and each other. The storm was a force of nature, indiscriminate and powerful, much like the forces that were trying to tear Grace's new life apart. They rode it out, the workshop holding firm like a ship in a tempest. By dawn, the wind had exhausted itself, leaving behind a world encased in a thin, brittle sheath of ice and an eerie, profound silence. The sky was a pale, washed-out gray. Together, they walked out to survey the damage. Trees were down, their branches shattered. But Grace's eyes went immediately to her claim, to the grove of cottonwoods Arthur had written about. Her heart sank. The largest of them, a magnificent old tree that stood like a sentinel on the edge of the burned patch, was grievously wounded. A massive limb had been torn away, and a jagged white split ran down the length of its trunk. It looked as though the storm had ripped its heart out. She walked toward it, a feeling of despair settling over her. The tree had been her landmark, a symbol of endurance, a promise of shade and permanence. Now it too was broken. She reached the tree and ran her hand over the raw, splintered wood of the wound. It felt like a defeat. Samuel came and stood beside her, his gaze traveling up the length of the damaged trunk. "It is strong," he said, his voice quiet. "The roots run deep." Grace looked at him, wanting to believe it,
Her own roots felt so shallow here, so easily torn up. As her eyes followed the line of the split, she saw it, tucked into a crevice where the old bark had peeled away. Sheltered by the very wound that had nearly destroyed it, was a tiny sprig of green. 2 small, perfect leaves, impossibly vibrant against the gray sky and the scarred wood. A new shoot, new life, emerging not in spite of the damage, but from within it. A slow smile spread across her face, the first genuine smile she had felt in weeks. It was a sign, it was hope, small and tenacious and utterly defiant. She pointed, her finger trembling slightly. "Look, Samuel!" He saw it, and a rare, small smile touched his own lips. It was a shared moment of understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of the resilience that lived in trees and in people. The sense of hope stayed with her all the way back to town. The air was clean and cold, and the sight of that small green shoot was burned into her mind. The legal fight was not over, but she felt a renewed strength to face it. She decided to check the telegraph office, hoping for word from Elias Blackstone. Mr. Harris was at his desk. He saw her enter, and the usual curiosity in his eyes was replaced by something else, something that looked like pity. He reached for a yellow envelope without a word and pushed it across the counter. Grace's fingers felt stiff as she tore it open. It was not from her lawyer. The message was short, the words typed in stark, impersonal capital letters that felt colder than the ice outside. Application for emergency injunction, filed with District Court. Stop. All use and development of Gable property, hereby frozen pending judicial review. Stop. C. Barrington, ESQ. The paper fluttered from her numb fingers. Frozen. He had done it. Charles had used the law like a club, and with a few simple words telegraphed from miles away, he had stopped her cold. The land, the tree, the small bud of hope, they were all still hers, but they were now just out of her reach, trapped in a winter of legal ice from which they might never thaw. The journey to the district courthouse in Laramie was a long and silent one, made in a borrowed buckboard wagon with Samuel Reed at the reins. The wind had a different voice out on the open plains, a low, constant moan that frayed the nerves. Grace sat beside him, a small leather portfolio on her lap containing every piece of paper related to her claim, the tax receipts, a copy of Arthur Gable's original homestead filing, even the letter from the postmaster confirming his death. She had prepared her case with the same meticulous care she used to sort lumber, leaving nothing to chance. But the law, she knew, was not like wood. Its grain was twisted, its knots hidden. Samuel did not speak of the hearing. He spoke of the land they passed, pointing out a hawk circling on an updraft, the way the snow lingered in the north-facing shadows of the gullies. His calm was a language of its own, a steadying presence against the anxiety that coiled in her stomach. He was not there as a witness or a supporter, but simply as a fact, a man who had offered a neighbor a ride. His presence an unspoken testament to the character he had judged for himself. The courthouse was the most imposing building Grace had seen since leaving the East. A 2-story structure of cut stone that was meant to project an authority the wilderness often ignored. Inside, the air was stale with the smell of old paper, unwashed bodies, and the faint, bitter tang of justice delayed. The courtroom was a large, cold room with a high ceiling. A pot-bellied stove in the corner fought a losing battle against the drafts. Charles Barrington was already there, seated at a table with a local lawyer, a slick, well-fed man named Horatio Caldwell, who Grace recognized as Miranda's husband. Charles looked perfectly at ease, his fine suit an armor of confidence. Miranda sat in the first row of benches, her back ramrod straight, a small, triumphant smile playing on her lips. A handful of Evermeadow residents were scattered in the gallery, their face grimly curious. Grace saw the Wilkins family, looking small and lost in the cavernous room, and Mrs. Langston, who gave her a short, encouraging nod.
The judge was a man named Elias Thorne, with a great white beard and eyes that had seen too much to be easily impressed. He listened, his face impassive, as Horatio Caldwell laid out his case. The lawyer's voice was smooth, reasonable, and full of carefully placed poison. "Your Honor," Caldwell began, "we are not here to question the tragedy of Mr. Gable's passing. We are here to question the highly irregular, indeed, the intentionally deceptive, manner in which his claim has been appropriated. The law requires a public posting of delinquent taxes for a full 30 days. Our records show it was posted for 29. He paused, letting the triviality of the point sound like a grave injustice. Furthermore, the payment was made by a woman known to the county clerk only as Grace Walker, a name we now know to be a complete fabrication. This entire transaction, from its inception, was built upon a foundation of misrepresentation." He gestured toward Grace. "This woman, whose true name is Whitmore, is the scion of an immensely wealthy Eastern family. She is not a simple homesteader. She is a person of means, using a false identity and a minor clerical error to seize land under the noses of a trusting community. We ask the court to sustain the injunction and declare the tax payment invalid, returning the land to the public domain for a proper, transparent auction." When he finished, the room was silent. Caldwell's arguments were thin, built on procedure and innuendo, but in the cold, formal air of the court, they felt heavy. Judge Thorne turned his gaze to Grace. "Miss Whitmore, your response." Grace stood. Her heart was pounding, but her voice was steady as she walked to the judge's bench. "Your Honor, my name is Grace Whitmore. I will not deny that. I came west seeking a life of my own, and I used a different name to ensure that it was a personal choice, with no intent to defraud." She opened her portfolio. As for the transaction, it was done in good faith. "Here is my receipt from the county clerk for the full amount of the delinquent taxes. Here is a sworn statement from the clerk, Mr. Harris, attesting that the notice was posted according to his standard practice, and that the one-day discrepancy was due to the month of February, having only 28 days this year, a fact he overlooked." A small titter went through the gallery. The judge's stony expression did not change, but he made a note. "Mr. Caldwell speaks of the community's trust," Grace continued, her voice gaining strength. "He claims I have deceived this community, but the people of a town are the best judges of character. I did not come to them with a famous name or a full purse. I came with only my willingness to work and be a neighbor." She laid one final document on the bench. It was a simple piece of paper, but it was covered in signatures, some elegantly scripted, others the labored scrawl of a hand more accustomed to a hammer than a pen. "This is a petition, Your Honor. It is signed by residents of Evermeadow. It asks that my tax payment be honored and that I be allowed to prove myself a worthy member of their community. The names on this paper include the Wilkins family, whose roof I helped repair. They include Mrs. Langston, with whom I have nursed the sick. They include the blacksmith, the liveryman, and others who have come to know me not by my name, but by my actions." Judge Thorne picked up the petition, his eyes scanning the list of names. He looked over at the gallery. At the faces of the people who had signed, Charles Barrington's confident expression wavered for the first time. This was a variable he had not anticipated. The judge leaned back in his chair, his fingertips steepled under his great beard. The silence in the courtroom stretched on, thick with tension. "The law is a precise instrument," he said at last, his voice filling the room. "It is not swayed by petitions or good intentions. An injunction has been filed based on a colorable legal claim. The question of the 29 versus 30 days is a matter of statutory interpretation that will require further briefs. The matter of the name, while distasteful, may not rise to the level of legal fraud." He looked directly at Grace, and his eyes were not unkind. "Therefore, the court is not prepared to nullify the tax payment at this time. However," He raised a hand to forestall any celebration. The court is also not prepared to dismiss the injunction. The temporary order freezing all development and use of the property will remain in effect until these legal matters can be fully resolved. That may take several months. He banged his gavel. This hearing is concluded.
It was a punch to the gut. She had not lost, but she had not won. The land was still in limbo. Her plans frozen. Her future held hostage by a lawyer's trick and a judge's caution. She felt a profound sense of despair. She had played by the rules. She had been honest. She had earned the trust of her neighbors. And still, it was not enough. The system, the one Charles Barrington knew so well how to manipulate, had defeated her. The ride back to Evermeadow was even quieter than the journey out. The weight of the judge's decision pressed down on her. A physical ache in her chest. All the work, all the hope. It felt like it had been for nothing. That night in the workshop, the silence was heavy, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Grace stared into the flames, her mind replaying the judge's words. Frozen. Her life was frozen. Samuel was at his workbench, sanding a piece of wood with long, steady strokes, the rhythmic sound usually a comfort, but tonight it only grated on her nerves. "It is not fair," she said, the words breaking out of her, small and tight. "I did everything right." Samuel stopped his work. He looked at her, his face half in shadow. "The law is not about what is fair, Grace. It is about what is written. You learned that today. So I am to do nothing, just wait for months while he ties my life up in legal knots." The frustration and helplessness she had been holding back all day finally boiled over. "I came here to build something, a house, a life, and he has taken the tools right out of my hands." Samuel put down his sanding block and walked over to the stove. Pouring 2 cups of coffee, he handed one to her. His hand was steady, his presence calming. "He has taken the right to build on the land." "For now," Samuel said, his voice a low rumble. "But he has not taken your hands, or your heart." He looked at her, his gaze direct and piercing. "If we can't build walls of wood, we will build walls of trust. We will build something the judge and the lawyer cannot freeze." His words struck her with the force of a physical blow. Build trust. It was not a platitude. It was a strategy, a way to fight back not in the cold courtroom, but in the heart of the community. An idea, wild and audacious, began to form in her mind, sparked by the flame of his quiet wisdom. The next evening, another notice appeared on the board outside Henderson's store. This one was in Grace's own clear, strong handwriting. It invited all residents of Evermeadow to a community meeting. They came, their faces a mixture of sympathy and curiosity. They packed the general store again, the mood entirely different from the last meeting. There was no hostility, only a quiet expectation. This time, Grace stood before them not as a defendant, but as a visionary. Samuel stood in the back, just as before, a silent pillar of support. "I know you all heard about the judge's ruling," she began, her voice ringing with a new energy. "My claim to the land is frozen. I cannot build my home." "Not yet," she paused. "Letting them absorb the setback. But that does not mean we have to stop building. The future of Evermeadow does not have to be frozen along with my legal papers." From a long roll of canvas, she produced a large drawing and tacked it to the wall. It was a simple, clean architectural plan, drawn with Samuel's sharp pencils on drafting paper. It was a drawing of a schoolhouse. A single large room with a row of tall windows on the south side to let in the winter sun. A small bell tower, a wide front porch. It was sturdy, practical, and beautiful in its simplicity. "Mr. Hargrove has taught the children of this town for 40 years, she said, her voice filled with passion. "He has done so in his own home, with few supplies. The Wilkins boy is learning his letters by a firelight. We can do better. We can give our children a proper place to learn, a place that will tell them that this town believes in their future." She pointed to the drawing. "I cannot build my house.
But I can design this, I can pledge the funds for the lumber, and I can pledge a corner of my land, the corner right by the old cottonwood tree for this school. The moment the law says that land is mine, but we do not have to wait for the judge to start. We can start building the trust, the commitment, right now. We can gather the materials. We can plan the work crews. We can build our school in our hearts and on paper, so that the day the injunction is lifted, we are ready to raise the walls. A stunned silence fell over the room. They had come expecting to hear about her legal troubles. Instead, she had given them a vision of their own future. She had taken her personal defeat and transformed it into a communal dream. Old Mr. Hargrove, the blind teacher, had tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. Mrs. Wilkins clutched her son's hand, her eyes fixed on the drawing as if it were a miracle. A low murmur of excitement, of possibility, spread through the crowd. In that moment, Grace Whitmore ceased to be the outsider, the rich Easterner. She became the architect of their hope. She could not yet build her house, but she had just laid the foundation for something far more important. The arrival of Thomas Sinclair was as quiet as the arrival of the train was loud. He did not come with the polished entitlement of Charles Barrington, but on foot from the station, carrying a single worn leather satchel. He was a young man with an old man's eyes, spectacled and startlingly observant, and a notebook that was already filled with spidery script. He found Grace and Samuel by the creek, surveying the foundation stones of the burned cabin, a place they now visited not as a ruin, but as a future. "Miss Whitmore," he asked, his voice calm and direct. "My name is Thomas Sinclair. I write for the Denver Chronicle." Grace stiffened, years of deflecting reporters rising as an instinct. Samuel stepped slightly forward, a silent, protective presence. "I am not here about your family's business," Sinclair said quickly, seeming to read her mind. "I am here because your lawyer, Mr. Blackstone, sent me a telegram. He said there was a story in Evermeadow, not about a runaway heiress, but about a town building a schoolhouse with a foundation of hope. He thought it was a story people needed to hear." His sincerity was disarming. He did not ask for an interview. He asked if there was a place he could stay, and if they could use another pair of hands. For the next 2 weeks, Thomas Sinclair became a part of the workshop's rhythm. He rented a room from the blacksmith, but he spent his days on the hill. He stacked lumber alongside Grace, his soft city hands quickly blistering and then callousing. He learned from Samuel how to use a draw knife to peel bark from logs, his notebook often set aside as he focused on the immediate, honest reality of the work. In the evenings, he would sit and listen. He spoke with the Wilkins family, who told him about the woman who fixed their roof and was teaching their son to read. He spent an afternoon with Mr. Hargrove, who spoke of Grace's vision for the school with the passion of a man seeing his life's dream made manifest. He wrote down Mrs. Langston's account of Grace's tireless nursing during the lung fever. Sinclair was not just collecting facts. He was absorbing the character of the town. He saw the quiet, profound partnership between Grace and Samuel, a connection built not on grand pronouncements, but on the shared language of work, on the handing over of a tool at the right moment, on a look of mutual respect across a half-finished window frame. He wrote about the one-armed carpenter who could join wood with the precision of a surgeon and who had built a fortress of dignity around his own quiet life. His articles, sent by telegraph, began to appear in the Chronicle. They were not sensational. They were simple, human stories. They painted a picture of a small, struggling town on the frontier, a community fighting not with guns, but with hammers and nails and a stubborn belief in its own future. The story of the frozen land and the unfrozen dream of a schoolhouse captured the public imagination. Other papers began to pick up the story. Evermeadow was no longer just a dot on a map. It was a symbol. Charles Barrington had sought to win his case in a courtroom. Grace, with Samuel's quiet guidance, was winning hers in the hearts of strangers 100 miles away. The news, when it came, arrived on a bright, cold morning that promised an early spring, Mr. Harris, the postmaster, all but ran up the hill from town, waving a yellow telegram envelope over his head, his face split by a grin. He handed it to Grace, his hand trembling with excitement. She opened it, her own hand surprisingly steady. The words were few, a dry legal summary that contained the power of an earthquake. Hearing concluded. Barrington petition denied. No evidence of fraud found. Clerical error deemed immaterial. Injunction lifted. Claim affirmed. Judge Thorne, Laramie District. Grace read it once, then twice. The words seemed to shimmer on the page. Affirmed. The fight was over. She had won. She looked up at Samuel, who had been watching her, his face unreadable. She held the telegram out to him. He read it, and for the first time, she saw the tension he had been carrying in his broad shoulders simply melt away. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, reaching his stormy eyes and turning them the color of a clearing sky. "Well then," he said, his voice a low, satisfied rumble. "Time to build." The news swept through Evermeadow like a Chinook wind. That afternoon, a small crowd of townspeople appeared on her claim. The Wilkins family, the blacksmith, the ranchers, Mrs. Langston. They came not with congratulations, but with tools in their hands and a quiet determination in their eyes. Led by Samuel, they began to work, not on the schoolhouse, not yet. First, they cleared a small, level patch of ground a little ways from the old foundation. With a speed and efficiency born of shared purpose, they raised a small, one-room cabin. It was a builder's shelter, a place for Grace to store tools and plans, a place for her to finally, truly live on her own land. The air filled with the scent of fresh-cut pine and the sound of hammers ringing in the clear mountain air. By sunset, it was done. 4 solid walls, a tight roof, a single window, and a sturdy door. As the others packed their tools and headed back to town, their faces flushed with the satisfaction of a good day's work, Samuel stayed behind. He brought Grace's trunk from his workshop and placed it inside the small cabin. He had made her a simple bed frame from clear pine and a small table and chair. The room was sparse, but it was hers. He lit the lantern he had hung from a ceiling beam, filling the small space with a warm, golden light. "You're home, Grace," he said softly. She stood in the doorway, overwhelmed. After all the running, all the fighting, all the uncertainty, she was here, on her own land, in her own room. The victory felt so vast, so final, it was almost terrifying. The war was over, and she did not know how to live in the peace. Samuel must have seen the conflict in her face. He stepped outside, giving her a moment. The sun had set, and the sky was a deep, star-dusted indigo. The mountain air was sharp and cold, but the small cabin behind her glowed with warmth. She turned and looked at the simple room, at the neat bed, at the solid walls that smelled of the forest. This was the first night of the rest of her life, a life she had chosen, had fought for, and it was a life she would begin alone, in this small room, surrounded by a great, dark wilderness. A tremor of fear, cold and sharp, went through her. It was the fear of the unknown, the fear of freedom, the fear of the profound silence that was about to descend. Samuel was standing a few feet away, his silhouette a dark, comforting shape against the stars. She could see his breath clouding in the cold air. He was waiting, respecting her solitude, but not abandoning her to it. She whispered his name, the sound barely disturbing the quiet. He turned to her. In the faint light from the doorway, he could see the apprehension in her eyes, the vulnerability of a soldier whose battle is finally over. "Is the first night scary?" she asked, her voice a fragile thread of sound. He closed the distance between them in 2 long, silent strides. He did not speak. He simply reached out and drew her against him. His embrace was not one of passion, but of profound, bone-deep comfort. He was solid and warm, smelling of pine and clean sweat and safety. She leaned into him, resting her head against his chest, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart. The tremor inside her began to still. He pulled her a little closer, his hand coming up to gently cup the back of her head. He lowered his face to hers, his beard soft against her hair. "Only till you'll learn how sweet it feels," he murmured, his voice a low vibration against her ear. His words were not about a single night or a single act. They were a promise of companionship, of shared burdens, of a peace that was sweeter than any victory. He tilted her chin up and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, hesitant at first, then deepening into a quiet certainty. It tasted of coffee and wood smoke and a trust that had been built plank by plank, day by day, in the shared silence of honest work. It was a kiss that healed, that anchored, that promised a future. When it ended, they simply stood together, their breathing falling into the same rhythm, two separate souls finding their home in the quiet space between them. Later, they sat at the small table in the lantern light. The door closed against the cold. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, joyful calm. Samuel pulled a pencil from his pocket, and taking a clean wood shingle from a pile by the door, he turned it over to its smooth, pale side. "The schoolhouse first," he said. "We will start framing it tomorrow." "Yes," she agreed, her voice soft. "The schoolhouse first. But after that—" He paused, the pencil hovering over the shingle. He looked at her, his eyes asking a question that needed no words. She gave him a small, certain nod. He smiled, and with a steady hand, he began to sketch. Not a grand house, but a simple, sturdy one, with a wide porch facing the morning sun, and a large window in the kitchen overlooking the split cottonwood tree, where a new shoot was stubbornly, faithfully, reaching for the light. Grace leaned in close, her shoulder brushing against his, and pointed to the drawing. Perhaps a stone fireplace. "Right here," she suggested, her voice full of a future that was no longer frightening, but sweet with 1,000 possibilities. The sound of hammers became the new heartbeat of Evermeadow. It was a steady, rhythmic pulse that began just after dawn and ended only when the last light faded from the sky. The construction of the schoolhouse was not just a project. It was a ritual, a collective act of creation that drew the town together in a way no Sunday sermon ever had. Samuel was the architect and the foreman, his quiet authority unquestioned. He moved among the rising frames with a fluid grace, his single arm performing the work of two. He showed the ranchers how to properly notch a beam, the blacksmith how to set the foundation posts true. He never raised his voice, but a look from him, a simple gesture with his hand, was enough to correct a mistake or guide a saw. He was building more than a school. He was teaching the town the language of his craft, the grammar of honest construction. Grace worked alongside him, her once soft hands now calloused and competent. She had shed the last vestiges of the Eastern lady. Her practical work dress often smudged with sawdust, her hair tied back in a simple knot. She hauled lumber, learned to drive a nail straight and true in 3 strokes, and spent hours on her knees, laying the smooth pine floorboards. She was the project's spirit, her unwavering belief in it, a fuel that kept everyone going, even when a late snowstorm threatened to delay them or a shipment of glass for the windows was late. The community embraced the work as its own Mr. Wilkins, whose roof Grace had patched, revealed a surprising talent for shingling. His movements on the steep pitch of the schoolhouse roof as deft and certain as a squirrel's. His wife, along with Mrs. Langston and the other women, kept a constant supply of hot coffee, fresh bread, and stew coming to the work site, turning the midday meal into a boisterous town picnic. Their children, their future pupils, played among the wood shavings, their eyes wide with wonder as the building grew before them. Even Miranda Caldwell was drawn into the orbit of the project. For weeks she had watched from a distance, her disapproval a palpable force, but it was impossible to remain the queen of a town whose social center had moved to a construction site. One afternoon, she appeared carrying a basket. Inside was a magnificent apple pie, its crust a perfect golden brown. She presented it not to Grace, but to the entire work crew, her expression a careful mask of neutrality. It was a gesture of truce, an acknowledgement that the town's center of gravity had shifted. The men ate the pie with gusto, and the next week, she brought another. Day by day, the drawing on the canvas became a reality. The walls rose, the roof was set, and the great windows were installed, flooding the interior with light. Grace and Samuel spent the evenings in her small cabin, planning the next day's work, their heads bent close together over his sketches in the warm lantern light. Their partnership was seamless, a quiet dance of shared thought and purpose. He would point to a structural detail, and she would already understand the problem he was solving. She would suggest an aesthetic touch, a curve on the porch railing, and he would nod, already seeing how to carve it from the wood. Finally, the day came. The last coat of white paint was dry on the walls. The small brass bell was hung in its tower, and the scent of pine and new beginnings filled the air. The Ever Meadow Community School was finished. The first day of school was an unofficial town holiday. The children arrived scrubbed clean, wearing their Sunday best. Before they stepped through the door, each one stopped at a basin of water Grace had set on the porch and solemnly washed their hands. A small, reverent act before entering this new, clean world. The Wilkins boy, who a few months ago could not spell his own name, clutched a brand new primer to his chest as if it were a holy text. Inside, the room was bright and airy, the sunlight streaming through the tall windows and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Mr. Hargrove stood by his new teacher's desk, a gift built by Samuel from a single, perfect piece of oak. Though his eyes could not see the new desks or the clean blackboard, he could feel the space around him, the solid promise of it. He ran a hand over the smooth, polished surface of his desk, and his face was transformed by a joy so pure it brought tears to the eyes of the parents watching from the back of the room. He tapped a small bell, and a hush fell over the children. "Welcome," he said, his reedy voice filled with a strength no one had heard in years. "Welcome to your school. In this room, we will learn about words and numbers. We will learn about the history of our great country. And sometimes, he tilted his head back as if he could see through the new roof. We will talk about the stars. We will learn their names and the stories they tell, so that you will always know your place in the universe, and you will never feel small." As the first lesson began, Mrs. Langston set up a long table outside, laden with freshly baked cakes and cookies and pitchers of cold milk. It was a celebration, a feast to consecrate the future. Grace and Samuel stood on the porch, watching through the open door. They saw the rapt faces of the children. They heard Mr. Hargrove's gentle voice, and they breathed in the sweet air of a dream made real. This building, born from the ashes of Grace's old life and the embers of her new hope, was the most beautiful thing either of them had ever helped to create. A week later, a thick envelope arrived with the mail. It was addressed to Grace Whitmore, and the return address was a law firm in Chicago. Her heart tightened. It had been months since she had thought of Charles Barrington or the world he represented. Inside was a letter, its formal, legalistic language a cold shock after the simple warmth of her new life. It informed her that Elias Blackstone, her mother's lawyer and her last trusted link to her past, had passed away peacefully in his sleep. A wave of quiet grief washed over her. He had been a kind, decent man in a world that had very few of them. The letter went on to state that Mr. Blackstone, as the executor of her mother's estate, had completed the final legal steps before his death, the remainder of her inheritance. A sum that was considerably larger than she'd imagined had been transferred to a trust in her name, fully and irrevocably under her sole control. The door to her old life was not just open. It had been taken off its hinges. She could return to Boston a woman of independent wealth, beholden to no one, not even her father. That evening, she showed the letter to Samuel. He read it in silence, his expression thoughtful. He folded it carefully and handed it back to her. He did not ask what she would do. He did not offer advice. He simply waited. "I could go back," she said, the words feeling strange in her mouth. "I could live in a fine house. I would never have to work with my hands again." Samuel looked at her hands, which were resting on the simple pine table between them. They were no longer the hands of a lady. The nails were short, the palms were calloused, and there was a small healing cut on her thumb from a slipped chisel. "You could," he said, his voice even. She looked around the small cabin, at the solid walls he had built, and out the window at the dark shape of the schoolhouse under the stars. She thought of the sound of the children's laughter, of Mr. Hargrove's tear-streaked face, of the shared satisfaction in a perfectly joined corner. "But my work is here," she said, a quiet certainty settling deep within her. "The life I want is here." A slow, warm smile spread across Samuel's face. He reached across the table and took her hands in his. "I know," he said. The next day, she sent 2 telegrams. The first was to the law firm in Chicago, instructing them to establish a substantial fund. Its purpose was to create the Blackstone Scholarship, an annual grant for any child from Ever Meadow who wished to pursue a higher education, and to purchase a library of books for the new school. She was transforming the profits of the textile mills into the currency of knowledge and opportunity. The second telegram was to her father. It was very short. "I am not coming home. I am home, Grace." That Saturday, the whole town gathered again. Samuel had spent the week in his workshop, and what he brought was a masterpiece. It was a long, beautiful sign carved from a single plank of cedar. The letters were raised and elegantly shaped, each one a testament to his skill and his love. Together, he and Grace carried it to the front of the school. The Wilkins boy and 2 others had dug the holes for the posts. With the help of the blacksmith, they raised the sign and set it in place. The late afternoon sun lit the wood, making the carved letters glow. It stood just in the shadow of the great, scarred cottonwood tree, whose new green shoots were now a thick cluster of determined leaves. The sign read, "Simply and proudly, Ever Meadow Community School." The season of flowers that followed the long winter was the most beautiful Grace had ever seen. The valley, once scarred by fire and locked in ice, erupted in a riot of Indian paintbrush, bluebells, and wild columbine. It was as if the land itself were celebrating the thaw, its colors a vibrant testament to the resilience of life. It was in this season, under the broad, leafy canopy of the scarred cottonwood tree, that she and Samuel were married. There was no church, no organ, no white lace imported from a distant city. Their cathedral was the open sky, their music the rustle of the new leaves and the distant laughter of children from the schoolhouse. The entire town was their witness. Grace wore a simple dress of blue calico, the color of the mountain sky, which she had sewn herself. Samuel wore a clean flannel shirt and his leather apron, which he refused to take off, claiming it was his most honest suit of clothes. Mr. Hargrove, his blind eyes turned toward the sound of their voices, officiated. He did not speak of scripture or law. He spoke of building. He said that a good marriage, like a good house, was built on a solid foundation of respect, framed with the strong timbers of shared work, and filled with the light of kindness. When he asked if they would take each other, to be partners in all the building that was to come, their vows were a simple and solemn, "We will." Samuel slipped a ring on her finger. It was not gold or silver. He had fashioned it from a bent horseshoe nail, hammered and polished until it shone with a dark, humble luster. It was a circle of iron, a symbol of strength, luck, and the unadorned, powerful thing that bound them together. The celebration that followed was a town potluck, a joyful feast of roasted venison, fresh bread, and a dozen different kinds of pie, spread on blankets in the grass. The blacksmith played a lively tune on his fiddle, and for the first time in her life, Grace felt the simple, uncomplicated joy of belonging. From the periphery, Miranda Caldwell watched. She did not participate in the dancing, but she had brought a large bowl of potato salad, and she stayed until the end, her expression one of thoughtful observation. The town she had once ruled through whispers and social exclusion had transformed. Its new currency was contribution, and its royalty were the woman who had envisioned a school and the man who had known how to build it. She was learning a new, and more difficult, language of community. Charles Barrington had departed a week before the wedding. He did not make a scene. He simply packed his fine leather bags, settled his bill at the hotel, and took the morning train east. Grace saw him on the station platform as she was picking up a parcel. He looked smaller somehow, diminished, a man whose power was tailored for boardrooms and courtrooms, but which had no purchase here in the thin, honest mountain air. He met her gaze across the tracks, and for a moment she saw not a villain, but a man trapped in the gilded cage she had escaped. He gave her a short, stiff nod, a final, silent admission of defeat, and then he was gone, a ghost of a life she no longer wanted. The years that followed were built plank by plank, like the house they raised beside the school. They worked side by side, their life a continuation of the rhythm they had found in the workshop. The house grew slowly, its foundation solid stone from the nearby creek, its walls the color of summer wheat. Samuel built a wide porch facing the sunrise, and Grace planted a garden that overflowed with vegetables and unruly flowers. Their home was not an empire of industry. It was a sanctuary, a place of quiet purpose and deep, abiding love. Ever Meadow grew, but it grew around the heart Grace and Samuel had helped to build. The school became the true center of the town. The library, funded by the Blackstone Trust, was a marvel. Its shelves filled with books that opened up the world to the children of the valley. The first Blackstone scholar, the Wilkins boy, went off to study engineering in Denver, promising to return and help build bridges and better irrigation for the valley. Miranda Caldwell, in a slow and pragmatic transformation, found her new place. She discovered she had a talent for organization. She became the town's unofficial librarian, her sharp mind perfect for cataloging the books and her once imperious nature softening into a fierce advocacy for literacy. She found that the respect she earned by helping a child find the right book was more satisfying than the deference she had once commanded with a cutting remark. Many years later, a traveler on the newly expanded rail line, a writer for a popular Eastern magazine, decided to stop in the small, unassuming town of Ever Meadow. He had heard a whisper of a story, a frontier legend about a schoolhouse built from ashes. He expected to find a rustic curiosity, a quaint local tale. He found something more. He found a town that felt different. The houses were well kept, the gardens were tended, and there was a palpable sense of shared pride. He saw the schoolhouse, its white paint weathered to a soft gray, the bell in its tower gleaming in the sun. It stood beside a great, gnarled cottonwood tree that bore a deep scar down its trunk, but whose branches were thick and full of life. He fell into conversation with a young man who was repairing a fence nearby. The young man told him the story. He spoke of a woman who came from the East with a secret name and a broken dream. He spoke of the fire, the injunction, and the community that was forged in the raising of the school. He pointed to a handsome, sturdy house on the hill, its porch covered in climbing roses. "That is their home," the young man said with a quiet pride. "She still helps at the school, and he can still build anything you can imagine, truer and stronger than any man with two hands." That evening, the writer sat on the porch of the town's small hotel. looking up at the house on the hill. A single lantern glowed in the window, a warm, steady light against the vast, dark expanse of the mountains. Inside, Grace, her hair now threaded with silver, sat across from Samuel, his own hair and beard a distinguished white. They were reading, their comfortable silence a testament to a lifetime of understanding. She looked up from her book and out the window, her gaze falling on the dark shape of the school, then on the town lights twinkling below. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, from the stifling drawing rooms of Boston to this simple, profound peace. She thought of the vast, crushing weight of the Whitmore Empire, an enterprise built to possess and control, to own a piece of the world. And she looked at the simple, solid roof over her head, at the man who was her partner, her anchor, her home. A final, clarifying thought settled in her heart, as true and solid as the foundation of their house. We do not build empires to own the world, she thought. We build a roof so the world can no longer own us. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. And do not forget to subscribe to Wild West Night, like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so more people can discover this tale.